Hey guys, thank you for joining us for another Men's Bible Brief. If you can, join us on Wednesday mornings. The information is on the screen. If not, we got you covered on YouTube right here. Well, let's go ahead and join the brief in progress. God bless you. What's up, fellas? Thank you for joining us for Men's Bible Brief. And every first Wednesday is open mic, and boy, we really had a heated one. It's a good thing we were online because I think this one may have gone to blows. But the good news is cooler heads did prevail, and we were able to have the conversation. And I'll share what that topic was today. But boy, it was a really heated one. Matter of fact, we're going to have to finish it next week. That's how heated it was. And guys just engaged. And I didn't even realize it was such a hot topic. And so I want to dive into that in just a moment. But just a few things before we jump in. First of all, let me give you our hump day food for thought. And it goes like this. There's nothing in this world that can trouble you as much as your own thoughts. That's really true. I don't know about you. Many times when I think about whatever anxiety or struggles I may have inside of me, usually it's just some bad thinking. And if I can change the thinking, it usually changes my disposition and my day. So hopefully that will be your experience. I do want to alert you to a few things before we jump into these questions today. The first is I want to encourage you to pick up a book entitled The Disciplines of a Godly Man by R. Kent Hughes. This is a Christian classic. If you were with us last year, we went through The Measure of a Man with Dr. Gene Getz, and we really spent some time for most of 2023 going through A Measure of Man and really dealing with those principles that can help us be better men in terms of our walk with God, in terms of our relationship with other people, as well as our families and our careers. Well, this is kind of something similar. And if you know anything about disciplines, you know those great athletes or those great singers or even the great speakers of our day or whoever we may admire, there were some disciplines, something they did every single day that they practiced routinely that helped them be the person they would become. Well, the same thing is of the Christian life. You need certain disciplines. And this is a Christian classic. And it's something you ought to have in your library. We're going to start going through this particular book in April. So I want to encourage you now to pick it up. You can get it over at Amazon. And I'm sure there are other places you can get it. But it is a classic. And I'm really looking forward to that study. Also, too, we want to kind of re-encourage brothers to see each other face-to-face and have that face-to-face conversation. It's always good to be online, but sometimes you need to see brothers face-to-face. And so we're going to have our brothers breakfast, and we want to try to do this more on a quarterly basis and be more consistent. And we will be at the Awake Breakfast and Lunch, which is here in Dallas off of Knoll Trail Drive. We've been there before. If you've been with us, it's been great conversation, great breakfast. And so that will be Saturday, March 30th. That's actually the Saturday morning before Easter, and that'll be at 8:30. And so just want to encourage you to be to put that on your calendar, make a mental note or make that a note in your digital phone just to remind you that that is coming. And so we only had a chance to deal with two issues, and the first issue was not as prominent an issue, and you would think that would be the one. But the second issue, boy, we really went at it. But it was good. It was good, and it was good to see that brothers had a place that they can say what was on their heart. They can express their passionate convictions, their disagreements, and then also even see a different viewpoint that may actually disagree with each other and still walk away. Hey, we may not agree, but that doesn't mean we still can't be brothers. And that's the spirit of what we try to do. But it was actually, I thought it was good that it did get heated. And to be quite honest with you, actually a few profane words were thrown around, some colorful profane words, I should say. And I said, we need to tap this down a little bit, but that just shows you how personal it is. So let me deal with the first question, and then I'll get to the heated question. So the first question that was thrown at me is this one: speak to the issue of tithes and New Testament giving. I grew up in a traditional Baptist church, and as far as the Baptists were concerned, from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible teaches tithing. And then I went to an evangelical school called Dallas Theological Seminary, and they said, no, tithing ended with the Old Testament law, which ended in Acts chapter 2 with the birth of the church. And therefore, after Acts chapter 2, you don't see anything about tithing. You see this principle called grace giving or New Testament giving. And I probably lean more to the latter. That's where I am. I'm not diminishing those that believe in tithing. The problem is if you're going to apply tithing, you need to go back and look at those tithing verses. Number one, first of all, it was more than one tithe, more than 10% is actually 3 tithes. So sometimes you pay 30% depending on the year, some years 20%, some years only 10%. So they were actually 3 tithes you have to pay. And so if we're going to truly be committed to biblical tithing, we should be paying 3 tithes some years. And I've never, matter of fact, been in a church that have preached 3 tithes. So that's the first thing. Number one, we're not being as biblical as we think. Number two, the nation of Israel was a government. It was a state. So the whole idea of tithing not only included their responsibility to support the religious apparatus or the temple and the priesthood, but also the state as well and society. And so those issues were actually joined together. Church and state were one in the Old Testament. They were commingled. And so you could say some of those tithes were actually taxes, if you will. We don't live in a country that commingles church and state finances. Okay, I'm not going to get into the church and state argument and all that kind of stuff. I know there's a lot of debate around that. But one thing we know, we don't commingle what we receive from the church with what we receive in taxes from the government. That's the idea that I want to point at. And so on those 2 fronts alone, you have a problem. Now, I know there's some proponents to tithing would say, well, but tithing predated the law. And you see that with Abraham, because he paid a tithe once he won a war and won a battle and redeemed his nephew Lot, who was in trouble. And so the argument goes, well, if tithing predated the Mosaic law, who are we to say that it doesn't post-date it? The problem is you don't really see the word tithe does not even show up after Acts chapter 2, really after Matthew 23 and 23, which is the last time that Jesus uses it. And when he's using it there, he's definitely using it within the context or the frame of an Old Testament Jewish person who's living under the law. And so I think you're hard pressed to say that tithing is a Christian or biblical standard. Now, as a church, each individual autonomous church has the responsibility, and we are Protestants, don't apologize for that, has a right to set whatever standards it wants to set in order to finance its ministry. And so at Christ Community, we do set 10% as a standard, at least a goal for people to reach. I have people who give 10%. I have people who give 12, 15%. I have people who give 8%, 7%, 5%, even 3%. So we give people the freedom. We set as a goal 10% that we believe is enough to finance the ministry that God has called us to do in the Richardson area. But as a rule, one is really, really hard pressed to find tithing as a New Testament principle. I always say, whatever you do, we ought to be a Christian people. We ought to be generous, and quite frankly, it ought to be sacrificial. If Jesus gave his life sacrificial, then we ought to give sacrificially. And usually 10% is going to be a sacrifice. And so that's kind of where I start. That's where I've been. We actually give more than 10% now, but I've always started there because I just believed that as a Christian, if Jesus gave his life sacrificially, then your generosity ought to be sacrificially. The second question, and the one that caused all the brouhaha in our Bible brief today, and I mean, it took up the whole brief, and we got to come back and hit it again. A lot of questions and comments were made on this one issue, and I just didn't know this had such play within the Black community. It usually has a lot of play in the broader sense of society, but usually I don't hear much of it within Black circles. But here was the questions. Are Christians required to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States? And boy, that question set off a firestorm. And I would say it was still good conversation. There were things that needed to be gotten out in the open that we can address it and really come to some clarity as to what we're called to do as a Christian. So let me do a couple things here. I want to give kind of the biblical basis. I want to deal with the issue of patriotism. I want to deal with the issue of allegiance. And because I think those are issues as well. And I even want to deal with the issue of serving in the military, because I had a number of individuals who served in the military and they just saw things a little bit differently. And that may weigh into this issue as well. And so first, let me just say, probably the dominant interpretation, at least in America, at least Christians in America, would probably say you do, because there was this kind of Christian nationalist patriotic sense that went with your Christianity. And there was a time you were required to pledge allegiance to the flag, and they would use scriptures as Romans 13, probably Jesus' word, render to Caesar's what belongs to Caesar's, render to God what is God's, which is interesting. I find that there he's not talking about allegiance, he's actually talking about taxes. And interestingly, the ones who quote it, they quote it for allegiance, but they always say, well, I shouldn't pay taxes. So, well, wait a minute, that's not what Jesus said. So, Paul even says you got to pay your taxes. So that's a misapplication of what Jesus says. But the idea is that, hey, governments in Romans 13 are ordained, and therefore we must do whatever the government tells us. The problem is that betrays the biblical witness and understanding and even the framing of Romans 13 within the whole canon from Genesis to Revelation, how the scriptures look at nations. Even since the beginning, the Tower of Babel, Egypt, Babylon with Daniel. You can put here Daniel 11 and 12. You can go so far to put here also in terms of what Jesus says about nations in Matthew 25. You can talk about the abomination, desolation, Revelation definitely, which talks about that Antichrist figure where an entire world will swear allegiance to one particular figure who will obviously lead some kind of confederated nations, if you will. The Bible sees that more in a negative light. Even Ephesians 6, which we tend to see more spiritual for family or what have you, or the devil trying to get me in terms of sickness, probably is more to deal with the spiritual wickedness and powers that empowers nation states, the wickedness. And again, that goes from Genesis to Revelation, whether it's Babylon, whether it's Egypt, the Roman Empire. There's a sense that there are dark spiritual forces that actually influences these nations and empires. And so that when Paul says in Romans 13 that we ought to submit to those governments, yeah, we're to obey the laws, we're to respect the state. But when they ask us to contravene our faith matters, that's where we must draw the line. And so I would say here, Christians definitely have the freedom if they choose to pledge allegiance to the flag. But as a Christian, you're not required as an act of faith to pledge allegiance. Matter of fact, the book of Philippians argues to the contrary, that our allegiance is to Jesus. And so understand in that culture, when the whole culture was saying Caesar is Lord, the church was saying, no, Jesus is Lord. And Christians were losing their life. And so they wouldn't pledge their allegiance to Caesar, and many of them were thrown into the arenas and devoured by lions and animals and killed by the sword with gladiators, all because they would not change their allegiance. And so are you, as a Christian, required by Christ to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States or any country where you find yourself living? I would say absolutely not. Are you required to respect the laws of that country? I would say absolutely yes, as long as it doesn't violate your Christian conscience and your faith principles. So that's where I would land. Well, this really spun off into a whole issue of patriotism and even serving in the military. And those who had served in the military said, well, you know what, this is a great country, I want to fight for it, and really got into this whole debate over whether this was a great country, was not a great country, and how it's treated black folk and what have you. And I mean, that thing went left. And again, as I said online, and I'll say today, I think that's what makes the country so great. There's some people who will swear this kind of unchallenged allegiance to the country and fight for it. And I'm like, hey, you have that right. You have that choice. You have that freedom. But there are others who love the country equally as much, would also spill blood, love it as much, but they also reserve the right to critique it. And I think that's what makes America great. And I don't think the patriotism of one is more than the other. But in our culture, that's the interpretation, that if there's any critique of the government or the administration that's in power, or a particular administration that's in power, if there's a critique of the police officers or the military, that somehow you are unpatriotic. And I just completely disagree with that. I think that's what makes our country great. It's not that we accept everything carte blanche, but that we can critique it because we want it to even be better than what it is. And boy, that was really a heated issue. And I can understand from the military side, because they feel, look, I've spilled blood over here. Many of my men in my church, they went to Vietnam, and when they came back, they were called baby killers. And they didn't get the appreciation that they felt they should have received. At the same time, you have a number of individuals in my church that served in the military, and their experience was racist. They felt they were marginalized. They had gone over and fought for their country, came back to a country that still wanted to treat them as a second-class citizen. So the opinions are very, very divided, very, very strong. And the takeaway for me was, hey, we thank God for our soldiers that served. We thank God for the men and women that fight to give us the freedoms that we have. But we also thank God that we can live in a country that we can embrace it patriotically, or we can critique it because we want it to be better. And I think both sides of the equation are fair. And I think this is where Christians get confused personally. We think Christianity boils down to two perspectives, or two binary perspectives, and that is Democrat or Republican, or conservative or liberal. And to reduce Christianity to those two platforms, I think, does a disservice and actually discredits the gospel. The gospel is way bigger than a political perspective or position or a political party. There's some things that do line up with the gospel that are conservative. There's some things that do line up with the gospel that are liberal. But to say that somehow Jesus is totally with one side and against the other is to use Jesus as a tool for your personal purposes. And I see that more today rather than the church carving out a niche and saying, no, we are a third group. And that's the difference between today's church and the early church. The early church did not fall for that. They didn't try to find out what the political sides were and then side with the one that would benefit them the most. No, they said we are a completely third group. We are a countercultural nation and reality, and we align ourselves with Jesus. We are a third voice. We're not a moderate voice. I think some people assume that if a Christian is critiquing and jabbing one and then coddling the other, somehow they're trying to find the middle ground. No. We're not a middle ground political entity. That's not Christianity. We are a third, completely separate entity from conservative, liberal, Republican, or Democrat. And I say that because we're going into deep political waters in 2024 where things are going to get really, really nasty and murky, and a lot of people are going to be confused. And it's time out in terms of trying to use Jesus to push our certain political agenda rather than simply be his follower and live out the faith principles he expects us to live out. And I know that's tough for a lot of people, but that's what he calls us to do. And that means we got to put down our personal political convictions, that from the pulpit to the pew, and we have to be the example and set the model and not be the drum major that leads a certain group for a particular agenda. And so that's what the conversation was. Boy, it really got heated. But again, I'm glad it happened in the Men's Bible Brief, because that's the place that we want it to be, a sacred and safe place where we can have these kinds of conversations and work out our differences. And we may not even come to an agreement, but at least we come to understanding, and that's what's important. God bless you. If you have questions, you surely can email us at men@ccrichardson.org, and we surely will take those questions, and we'll be looking for you in the next video. Take care.